Canton, Massachusetts. A brutal blizzard is burying the suburbs, but on the manicured lawn of a veteran officer's home, a dark shape breaks the surface of the snow. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. It is the frozen body of Boston officer John O'Keefe. His skull shattered, his eyes swollen shut. While just steps away, his colleagues are inside celebrating. This isn't a simple accident. It is the opening shot of a legal civil war. A broken taillight on a luxury SUV will soon transform a professor into a calculated killer, or the victim of a massive multi-agency cover-up. In a town built on blue blood, the question remains, was he left to die, or was he discarded? Into this world of quiet sacrifice stepped Karen Reed. On paper, she was the demographic opposite of the insular, blue-collar police circles O'Keefe frequented. Reed was a woman of high intellect and corporate ambition, a Bentley University professor and an equity analyst for one of the world's largest investment firms. She navigated the high-stakes world of finance with a precision that made her a formidable figure in her field. However, her professional success masked a personal resilience forged through chronic health struggles. For years, Red had battled Crohn's disease, a condition that demanded a disciplined, often restrictive lifestyle. This wasn't a woman who lived recklessly. She was a woman who calculated risks, both in the market and in her daily health. When she and O'Keefe rekindled a connection during the early days of the pandemic, it seemed like a meeting of two stable forces. They were both in their 40s, both settled in their careers, and both seemingly ready for a partner who understood the weight of adult responsibilities. But the union wasn't without its friction points. Reed was moving into a ready-made family, a house in Mansfield that already had its own rhythms, its own history, and two children who were the center of O'Keefe's universe. The transition was complex. While the couple shared high-end vacations and a social life that spanned the affluent suburbs of Norfolk County, the daily grind of guardianship added a layer of pressure. There were whispers of arguments over the children, over the division of labor, and over the typical stresses that plague any relationship where two independent lives are forced to merge. Despite this, they remained a fixture in their social circle, a circle that was heavily dominated by the blue wall of the Boston Police Department. This social landscape is where the story becomes murky. The Canton Circle was a tight-knit web of law enforcement families, including the Alberts and the McCabe's. These were people who had grown up together, worked together, and protected one another. Brian Albert, a fellow Boston police officer, owned the home at 34 Fairview Road, the very house where the night would eventually end. To be in this circle was to be part of an unofficial brotherhood where loyalty was the highest currency. Karen Red, the finance professional from outside the force, was always something of an outlier in this group. She was the civilian among officers, the academic among street cops. By the winter of 2022, the couple had been together for roughly 2 years, navigating the highs of companionship and the lows of suburban tension. They were two people trying to build a future in the shadow of a looming New England winter, unaware that the insular world they socialized in was about to become the site of a national controversy. The Mansfield home, once a sanctuary for O'Keefe's niece and nephew, was about to be left hollow, and the woman who shared his bed would soon be cast as his executioner. The relationship between Karen Reed and John O'Keefe was not a product of a whirlwind suburban romance. It was a revival, a second attempt at a spark that had first flickered nearly 2 decades earlier. Back in the mid-2000s, they had dated briefly as young professionals, but the timing was off, and their lives had drifted into different orbits. When they reconnected in 2020, the world was in the grip of a global standstill. The isolation of the pandemic acted as a strange, pressurized incubator. They found each other again on social media, two people now in their 40s, weary of the transient nature of modern dating and looking for something that felt like home. For Karen, O'Keefe represented a rare, grounded stability. He was a man of service, a protector by trade, and a devoted guardian to his orphaned niece and nephew. For O'Keefe, Reed was an intellectual equal, a woman whose financial acumen and professional independence were a stark, refreshing contrast to the often insular world of the Boston Police Department. By the time the snow began to accumulate in early 2022, the couple had spent nearly 2 years navigating a shared life in Mansfield. But their home was never truly theirs alone. It was a house defined by the presence of 2 teenagers and the heavy, lingering shadow of their loss. O'Keefe had transformed his bachelor existence into a relentless cycle of domestic duty, school schedules, sports practices, and the quiet, constant management of grief. Red stepped into this ready-made family not just as a girlfriend, but as a provider. She reportedly spent tens of thousands of dollars on the children, funding vacations, electronics, and daily comforts that a police officer's salary could not always accommodate. She was seen at their games and school events, trying to weave herself into a family tapestry that had been torn and mended before her arrival. Yet beneath the surface of high-end dinners and suburban normalcy, the pressure was creating deep, jagged fractures. The transition from a fiercely independent corporate lifestyle to the role of a bonus parent is a massive psychological shift for anyone. But for Reed, it was compounded by the physical toll of her Crohn's disease. There were days when her body simply revolted, leaving her exhausted and in need of a quiet sanctuary that a house with 2 teenagers rarely provided. On the other hand, John O'Keefe was a creature of the blue wall. His sanctuary was not silence. It was the loud, boisterous camaraderie of the local bars in Canton and South Boston. He found his relief in the company of fellow officers, men like Brian Albert and Matthew McCabe, where the air was thick with the scent of stale beer and the rhythmic, aggressive cadence of police shop talk. Karen Reed was always something of an outsider in this brotherhood. She was the professor among street cops, the finance executive among men who prided themselves on blue-collar grit. This friction point allegedly became a flashpoint during a New Year's Eve getaway to Aruba just weeks before the tragedy. What was intended to be a romantic reprieve from the Massachusetts winter reportedly devolved into a theater of public conflict. Witnesses described a searing argument that erupted in the hotel lobby, a shouting match that left the rest of their social circle uncomfortable. Reed had allegedly observed O'Keefe in a conversation with the wife of another officer and, fueled by a mixture of exhaustion and deep-seated insecurity, reportedly accused him of infidelity in front of their peers. It wasn't just a spat, it was a fundamental breakdown of trust. Upon their return to the States, the atmosphere in the Mansfield home turned icy. O'Keefe reportedly confessed to friends that the relationship had become a source of constant stress, a burden he was no longer certain he wanted to carry, alongside the responsibility of raising his sister's children. He was reportedly seeking a graceful exit, a way to untangle their lives without causing further trauma to the household. Red, meanwhile, was described by some as becoming increasingly vigilant. Her messages to O'Keefe shifted between profound affection and sharp, biting resentment. She reportedly monitored his movements with a forensic intensity, questioning his loyalties and his whereabouts. They were trapped in a classic, exhausting cycle of breaking up and making up, their lives fused by shared finances and the needs of the children, while their emotional connection was fraying at the seams. The social dynamics of Canton added another layer of complexity. To be an Albert or a McCabe in that town was to be part of a local dynasty. They were the unofficial royalty of Norfolk County law enforcement, a tight-knit web of families who had grown up on the same streets and now patrolled them. When Red and O'Keefe socialized with this group, they were stepping into a world where loyalty to the circle was the highest currency. For a woman like Reed, who valued transparency and intellectual rigor, the unspoken rules and fierce protections of the Canton Circle must have felt like a foreign language. On the Friday before that fateful Saturday morning, the weather was not the only thing turning hostile. Reed had been navigating the demands of her high-stakes career, likely preoccupied with the social obligations of the upcoming weekend. O'Keefe was focused on the routine of the kids, the school runs, and the preparations for the massive storm that every meteorologist in the state was promising. There was no outward sign that this was the end of their story as a couple. They were simply 2 people in a failing relationship, moving through the motions of a Friday night in January. But as the first flakes of the nor'easter began to drift down through the streetlights of Canton, the stage was set for their private misery to explode into a national scandal. The blue wall was about to be tested and the woman who had spent 2 years trying to find her place within it was about to be cast as its greatest enemy. The evening of Friday, January 28, 2022, began with the kind of restless energy that always precedes a major New England storm. Meteorologists had been sounding the alarm for days. A massive nor'easter was tracking toward the coast, promised to bury the suburbs of Boston under a foot or more of heavy, wet snow. In Canton, the air already held that metallic, biting chill that signals a deep freeze. For John O'Keefe, it was meant to be a reprieve, a night to step out of his role as a guardian and reconnect with the boisterous, blue-blooded world of his fellow officers. Around 9 p.m., he and Karen Reed arrived at C.F. McCarthy's, a local staple where the warmth of the bar and the hum of conversation offered a sharp contrast to the gathering dark outside. Surveillance footage from the establishment captured a couple that seemed, at least for the moment, in sync. They were seen at the bar, leaning into one another. O'Keefe in a casual pullover, Reed in a black top, both of them sharing the easy rhythmic gestures of people who had spent hundreds of evenings, just like this one. O'Keefe was drinking Tito's and soda, served in a tall glass with a lemon wedge, a detail that would later be scrutinized with forensic intensity. Red was seen with a glass of her own, a clear liquid that the prosecution would later argue was the beginning of a heavy night of consumption. They weren't alone for long. The social gravity of Canton meant that every few minutes, a familiar face would emerge from the crowd. They chatted with friends and colleagues, the atmosphere light and unburdened by the storm warnings flickering on the overhead televisions. But as the clock neared 11 p.m., the group decided to shift the scene across the street to the Waterfall Bar and Grill, a slightly more spacious venue that could better accommodate the growing circle of officers and their spouses. The walk across the street was short, but the wind was picking up, swirling the first few flakes of snow through the yellow glow of the streetlights. Inside the waterfall, the group expanded to include the heavy hitters of the local social scene. Brian Albert, a prominent Boston police officer, his wife, Nicole, and Jennifer McCabe, Nicole's sister, and a central figure in the web of Canton families. Also present was Brian Higgins, an agent with the ATF who shared a close, if complicated, friendship with the couple. The group huddled around a high-top table near the back, the camaraderie typical of a tight-knit law enforcement circle. The footage from the waterfall shows O'Keefe and Reed moving through the space with comfort. At one point, they are seen embracing, a brief, cinematic moment of affection that would later be used by the defense to argue that there was no murderous intent in the air that night. As the bar's lights flickered for last call just after midnight, an invitation was extended. The Alberts were heading back to their home at 34 Fairview Road for an after-party. It was a casual gathering to mark Brian Albert Jr.'s 23rd birthday, and the group was encouraged to follow. For O'Keefe and Reed, it was a decision that would change everything. At 12:11 a.m., surveillance cameras captured them leaving the waterfall together. They stepped out into a world that had transformed in the 3 hours they'd been inside. The blizzard had officially arrived. The ground was now a slick, white sheet, and the air was a chaotic blur of driving snow. They climbed into Red's luxury Lexus LX 570, a heavy 3-ton SUV designed to handle exactly these conditions. The engine's low growl was masked by the howling wind as they pulled away from the curb. Red was behind the wheel, navigating the intensifying whiteout, while O'Keefe sat in the passenger seat, likely checking his phone for the address. They weren't entirely sure of the way. Jennifer McCabe later testified that she spoke with O'Keefe over the phone around 12:14 a.m. to provide specific directions to the Fairview residents. The drive was roughly 2 miles, a journey that usually takes 6 minutes but felt much longer as the Lexus's headlights struggled to cut through the wall of white. At 12:24 a.m., the heavy SUV pulled up to the curb in front of 34 Fairview Road. The house was a large colonial-style home, its windows glowing with the party inside, but the exterior was a dark, frozen landscape. What happened in the next 10 minutes remains the black hole at the center of this case. According to the prosecution's timeline, the Lexus didn't stay parked for long. They argue that within minutes of arriving, a violent confrontation occurred, or perhaps a tragic alcohol-fueled mistake that ended with Red backing her massive vehicle into O'Keefe, striking him with enough force to shatter the taillight and send him sprawling onto the front lawn. However, a different scene was being observed by those outside. Ryan Nagel, who had driven to the house with two friends in a Ford F-150 to pick up his sister, testified to seeing the black Lexus idling at the curb. He stated that he saw a woman, Karen Reed, sitting in the driver's seat alone. He described the vehicle's movements as safe and deliberate, noting that he didn't see any sign of a struggle or a body in the snow as they pulled away. Inside the Albert home, the party was in full swing, yet every person in that house, nearly a dozen witnesses, would later testify that they never saw John O'Keefe enter. They saw the Lexus outside, they saw the headlights, but the gentle giant never walked through the door. By 12:32 a.m., the Lexus was gone. Karen Reed had allegedly grown impatient or frustrated when O'Keefe didn't return to the car, and she began the treacherous drive back to O'Keefe's home in Mansfield. Her phone records show the device connecting to his home Wi-Fi at 12:36 a.m., a 4-minute journey that the prosecution claims was a frantic flight from a crime scene, while the defense argues it was the actions of a woman who assumed her boyfriend had simply stayed at the party without her. As Reed walked onto the hardwood floors of the quiet house in Mansfield, the storm was reaching its peak. Back at 34 Fairview Road, the front lawn was becoming a graveyard. John O'Keefe lay in the grass just feet from the roadway, his body slowly being entombed by the relentless snowfall. He was dressed for a bar, not a blizzard. No hat, no gloves, and only a single shoe remained on his foot. The other was nowhere to be seen. The people inside the house continued their celebration, oblivious, or perhaps, as the defense suggests, very much aware that a brother in arms was cooling in the dark just outside their front door. The silence of the Mansfield home and the roar of the Canton wind were the only witnesses to the transition from a Friday night out to a life-shattering tragedy. The silence inside John O'Keefe's Mansfield home broke just before 5 a.m. Karen Reed had drifted into a restless sleep on the couch, still wearing the clothes from the night before, but the realization that the bed upstairs was empty hit her with the force of a physical blow. The storm was still raging outside, a relentless wall of white, and her boyfriend, a man of rigid habits and deep responsibility toward the children sleeping in the rooms above, had vanished. Between 4:33 a.m. and 5 a.m., Reed's panic manifested in a digital blizzard of her own. She placed 53 calls to O'Keefe's cell phone, each one sliding into a voicemail that would never be checked. Her voice, captured in the recordings, transitioned from irritation to a jagged, high-pitched terror. Desperate for answers, Reed reached out to the woman who had been the social architect of the previous night, Jennifer McCabe. When McCabe answered her phone at 5:07 a.m., she was met with a woman who sounded completely unmoored. Reed was screaming, her thoughts tangled in a dark web of possibilities. She told McCabe that John hadn't come home, that she didn't know where she had left him. In a detail that would later become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, McCabe claimed that Reed looked out at her Lexus LX 570 idling in the driveway and noticed a cracked rear taillight, wondering aloud if she could have hit him. By 5:30 a.m., a search party of 3 women had formed in the pre-dawn gloom: Reed, Jennifer McCabe, and Carrie Roberts, another close friend of O'Keefe. They navigated the treacherous, unplowed streets of Canton in Roberts' vehicle, the windshield wipers struggling against the freezing crust of the nor'easter. The conversation inside the car was a frantic loop of speculation. Reed was reportedly inconsolable, her eyes fixed on the drifts of snow passing the window. They checked the route they had taken, peered into the dark windows of the Waterfall bar, and finally, as the first gray light of a miserable Saturday morning began to bleed into the sky, they turned onto Fairview Road. The Albert residence at number 34 was a dark silhouette against the white landscape. As the car slowed, Reed screamed for Roberts to stop. Despite the near-zero visibility and the heavy accumulation of snow, Reed claimed to see a dark shape on the lawn. She bolted from the vehicle before it had fully settled, her feet sinking deep into the drifts. Behind her, McCabe and Roberts followed, their breath hitching in the frigid air. There, lying on his back beneath a light shroud of fresh powder, was John O'Keefe. The scene was a visceral, frozen nightmare. O'Keefe's body was positioned roughly 12 feet from the curb, his arm extended as if reaching for a door that was no longer there. His face was a mask of trauma. His eyes were swollen, a deep, bruised purple, and a cluster of jagged lacerations marked his right arm. He was missing a shoe. The gentle giant was cold to the touch, his body already stiffening in the New England frost. Red collapsed onto him, her screams muffled by the roar of the wind, attempting to use her own body heat to breathe life back into a man who had likely been dead for hours. In the chaotic minutes that followed, Jennifer McCabe dialed 911. Her voice was frantic as she reported a man down in the snow, unresponsive and dead cold. As they waited for the sirens to pierce the storm, McCabe and Roberts later testified to a series of haunting outbursts from Reed. They claimed she was walking in circles, her hands over her mouth, repeating a rhythmic, devastating confession. "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." To the prosecution, this was the spontaneous utterance of a guilty woman. To the defense, it was a hysterical question, a woman in shock trying to make sense of a world that had just collapsed, asking, "Did I hit him?" First responders arrived at 6:04 a.m., their boots crunching on the frozen lawn as they pushed through the crowd of hysterical women. They found O'Keefe in cardiac arrest, his core temperature so low it didn't even register on their initial equipment. As the paramedics worked to stabilize him, clearing the snow from his airway and beginning the rhythmic compressions of CPR, they noted a bizarre detail. The lawn of 34 Fairview Road remained eerily quiet. Despite the flashing blue and red lights, the wail of the sirens, and the shouting of emergency crews, the front door of the Albert home, the home of a fellow Boston police officer, remained shut. No one from the after-party emerged to see what the chaos was about. No one stepped out into the cold to help a brother in arms. By the time the ambulance pulled away, headed for Good Samaritan Medical Center, the investigation had already begun in the snow. A Canton police officer, shielded from the wind by his cruiser, noticed several pieces of broken red and clear plastic scattered near the spot where O'Keefe had been found. They were the jagged remains of a vehicle's taillight. As the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, the blue wall began to settle around Fairview Road, and the woman who had spent the morning searching for her boyfriend was about to become the primary suspect in his murder. The discovery of the body was the end of the search, but it was the beginning of a conspiracy theory that would set the entire state of Massachusetts on fire. The investigation into the death of John O'Keefe began not with a meticulous forensic sweep, but with a series of makeshift decisions that would later haunt the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. As the ambulance sped away from 34 Fairview Road, the Canton police and state police investigators faced a crime scene that was rapidly disappearing under inches of fresh snow. In a detail that would become an emblem of the defense's argument, investigators reportedly collected blood samples from the snow using red Solo cups borrowed from a neighbor, sealing them with duct tape. This lack of standard forensic protocol was the first crack in a case that was about to become a chasm. Lead investigator Michael Proctor of the Massachusetts State Police took the reins of the case almost immediately. To the public, he was a veteran investigator. To the defense, he was a walking conflict of interest. Proctor, it was later revealed, had deep-seated social ties to the Albert family. His wife was close friends with the family inside the house where O'Keefe's body was found, and he had socialized in the same tight-knit Canton circles for years. Despite this, he did not recuse himself. Instead, he steered the narrative toward a single conclusion. Karen Reed had killed her boyfriend in a fit of drunken rage. The prosecution's theory was built on the physical evidence found in the drifts. They pointed to the shards of red and clear plastic discovered near O'Keefe's head, jagged pieces that a state lab later matched to the broken taillight of Reed's Lexus LX570. They argued that the vehicle's internal computer data showed a reverse event at 12:42 a.m., claiming Reed accelerated backward at 24 miles per hour, striking O'Keefe with the rear of the 3-ton SUV and sending him spiraling into the grass. By early February, the initial charge of manslaughter was upgraded to second-degree murder. But then, the defense team, led by high-profile attorneys Alan Jackson and David Yannetti, began to pull at the threads of the blue wall. They didn't just argue for Reed's innocence, they alleged a massive multi-agency cover-up designed to protect one of their own. They pointed to the wounds on O'Keefe's right arm, a series of parallel, jagged lacerations that didn't resemble the blunt force trauma of a car bumper. Instead, they brought in forensic experts who suggested the marks were consistent with animal scratches, specifically a dog. The Alberts owned a German Shepherd named Chloe at the time of the incident, a dog that was reportedly rehomed across state lines shortly after the investigation began. The midpoint pivot in the investigation came through a digital bombshell. Forensic experts hired by the defense examined the cell phone of Jennifer McCabe. They claimed to find a Google search performed at 2:27 a.m., 3 hours before the body was officially discovered. The search query was chilling. Hose long to die in cold. While the prosecution's experts argued this was a timestamp glitch caused by an open browser tab from later that morning, the damage was done. To the growing Free Karen Reed movement, this was proof of a conspiracy. They argued O'Keefe had been beaten inside the Albert home, attacked by the dog, and then dragged out into the snow to die, while the party guests coordinated their stories. As the case moved through 2023, the investigation expanded into the federal realm. The U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI launched an independent probe into the integrity of the local investigation, a move virtually unheard of in a state murder case. This federal intervention yielded a 3,000-page report that reportedly contained expert testimony from independent accident reconstructionists. These experts, who had no ties to either side, concluded that the damage to the Lexus and the injuries to O'Keefe were physically impossible to achieve through a vehicle strike at 24 miles per hour. They suggested that O'Keefe's head trauma, a massive fracture to the rear of his skull, was more consistent with a fall onto a hard surface, like a basement floor, than a collision with a plastic taillight. The community of Canton became a powder keg. Local atmosphere shifted from quiet suburban mourning to a town under siege by truth seekers and protesters. Aidan Kearney, a local blogger known as Turtle Boy, amplified the defense's claims, leading to a surge of protesters in pink shirts, Reed's signature color, lining the streets outside the Norfolk County Courthouse. Rumors of burner phones, deleted text messages, and basement floors being replaced in the Albert home circulated like wildfire. The lead investigator himself, Michael Proctor, was eventually forced to admit during a deposition that he had sent derogatory, unprofessional texts about Red to his colleagues, calling her crazy and making disparaging remarks about her medical condition. The frustration of the detectives was palpable as their slam dunk hit-and-run case transformed into a referendum on police corruption. Every piece of evidence was now viewed through a lens of suspicion. Did the taillight fragments appear in the snow only after the police seized Reed's car? Why did the ring camera footage from O'Keefe's driveway appear to have a gap at the exact moment Reed was seen leaving to search for him? The investigation had become a hall of mirrors. The why and how of John O'Keefe's final moments were no longer just a legal question. They were a cultural obsession, fueled by the paradox of a man left to freeze in a town where the police were supposed to be the ones who kept watch. The 2024 trial of Karen Reed was a televised collision of two opposing realities. For 10 weeks, the Canton Circle took the stand, defending their family names, while the prosecution painted Red as a scorned woman who used her 3-ton SUV as a weapon. But the foundation of the Commonwealth's case crumbled under the testimony of its own lead investigator, Michael Proctor. He was forced to confront his own toxicity, reading aloud private, disparaging text messages about the woman he was investigating. Despite the forensic debates over taillight shards and digital timestamps, the jury reached a stalemate. On July 1st, 2024, the judge declared a mistrial. The verdict was no verdict at all. Canton remains a town fractured by the blue wall and a movement in pink. While the defense fights for the dismissal of charges based on claims that the jury had actually reached a secret consensus to acquit on 2 counts, the legal clock has reset. In 2025, the battle begins again. The lawn at 34 Fairview Road is clear now, the snow long since melted, but the house remains a monument to a mystery with no easy exit. For John O'Keefe's family, the courtroom isn't a sanctuary. It's a battlefield where his memory is caught between two warring versions of the truth. Whether Karen Red is a killer or a scapegoat, one reality remains. A protector was left in the cold while his own circle celebrated inside. In Canton, justice isn't just blind, it's buried under the weight of the blue wall and the echoes of a storm that never really ended. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.